welcome to everybody that has joined us today. We will have the discussion, and then you are welcome to submit questions on the chat or Q&A. And I will just mention that our moderator tonight is Mr. Dan Schlesinger, who is the chairman of Hebrew University's International Board of Governors. We're very glad to have him, and I'm handing the mic over to him. Thank you, Dan.
Thanks very much, Naomi, and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. As I think most of you know, Hebrew University has been doing a lot of these webinars, a lot of discussions to help keep us stimulated and entertained during this period of isolation. Today, we're in for a real treat. The program Inside Our Heads, Convergence of our Art and the Brain. We have two phenomenal panelist speakers today. As Naomi said, we hope to have some opportunity at the end of the program for questions from participants. So please use the chat function to send in questions as they occur to you, and then Naomi will take us through those at the end of the program. It's my honor to introduce our two panelists. First is Paula Crown, who is an international multimedia artist and technologist. She works in drawing, painting, video, sculpture, and augmented reality. Her studio practice is a lab for research and discovery and expands boundaries of materiality and scale while being rooted in an art historical canon. Its purpose is to internationally explore ideas about navigating the spaces we inhabit internally and physically. Paula's iterative process acknowledges failure as data where ideas evolve and solutions are engineered in innovative ways. Art is a language, a conduit for ideas and expressions unique to the human species. It's coexisted with the earliest human civilizations. It's not an adornment, it is a manifestation of thought. Welcome, Paula. Our other speaker is Professor Dewell. He is the Jack H. Skirball Professor in Brain Research, Human Cognitive Neuroscience Lab at the Edmond and Lily Safra Center for Brain Sciences at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. The focus of Professor Dewell's lab is on the interface between automatic, non-conscious stages of information processing in the brain and conscious perception and action. Professor Dewell uses neuroimaging techniques like EEG and MRI to study brain function in healthy individuals, as well as in stroke patients, especially ones with damage to the right side of their brain who become unaware of the part of space opposite their lesion. And now, for those of you not familiar with it, we'd like to briefly introduce Paula's 2013 work titled Inside My Head, a Contemporary Self-Portrait, which is now on view virtually at the Hebrew University Art Gallery website. And Naomi will post a link to that, I'm sure, on the chat function for those of you who, I'm sure all of us who have not seen it will be captivated by it, and we'll take a look at it after this program is done. Paula's work, this particular work, Inside My Head, is a portion of a digital work that grew out of her own experiences. Beset by migraines since childhood, she took MRIs of her brain and animated these high-tech images of her internal landscape. The piece is a self-portrait rendered from the inside out, an intimate view of her personal topology. It functions on a dual level of imagination, providing us insight into what thinking and our inner brain anatomy look like. The images evoke the cosmos and the starscapes from which we evolved. And I think you'll understand what I mean now as Francine or Naomi will take us through the video. Well, I'm sure that leaves us all tremendously intrigued. Those of you who haven't seen more of it, I'm sure are eager to see more, and we will provide you that opportunity. But please wait till after the program is over, because you don't want to miss any of this discussion that's upcoming. Paula's self-portrait, Inside My Head, and Professor Dewell's neuroscientific research reveal intriguing overlaps in art and science and their shared journey to understand the workings of the human mind. They both explore the notions of the sensory and levels of perception and consciousness itself. We hope you'll enjoy this intimate conversation, bringing an artist's studio and a scientist's lab, bringing together an artist's studio and a scientist's lab thousands of miles apart. So now, to begin, Leon, as a brain researcher, what did you find interesting about Paula's perception and depiction of her own brain? And what would you like to ask her about her experience and how it impacted her art?
Thank you, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk to Paula and to you. I found the piece mesmerizing. I mean, as I think I've mentioned to you before, for me, the brain, the anatomy of the brain, and these things that you see on the screen are like familiar landscapes. So I know them all too well. You know, I've looked at many brains. I've looked at my brain. I've looked at brains, open skulls with live brains during surgery. This is a really familiar terrain, but the way Paula depicted it is at the same time so different from the way I'm used to seeing it. And I was especially struck by the duality. So there are two brains there. There's always two things on the screen. You can see it behind Paula here in her background. The two things which I wondered, what they represent. I mean, I think of several things. I mean, is it the two hemispheres of the brain? Is it one looks sometimes more analog and one looks more digital and processed? So this look into the brain was really a different way for me to see the thing that I'm usually so familiar at looking at from all these different directions. And I was wondering, I want to ask Paula first of all whether it was important for you that it was your brain that you were actually showing. So sometimes when I introduce myself to students in the first class of the year, I actually introduce myself by showing them my head, and then I open it virtually on the screen to expose my brain, and then I take a slice of the brain virtually and I show them. So it's like a very intimate way of presenting myself. And I was wondering whether it was important in the art piece that it was actually your brain that you were showing.
So it's interesting, Leon, to think about it. I guess the work was motivated by having these images. These were MRI images, and at some point I hope that we get to functional MRI streaming. But the idea that we had something that was expressing a part of me and thinking about it in the canon of self-portraiture, which ostensibly could have gone back to earliest humanity when people saw pictures of themselves or reflections of themselves in water, right? And what came of that. So I just went down this sinkhole of what was the architecture here that held the thinking process, and what that thinking process might look like. And I played around with the dimensionalization of these drawings of the brain, and the music was a critical part of it. So you're so right about the duality. In some ways, they represent eye orbs into the mind's eye. And the music consists of both the sonification of the architecture of the brain and a improvised work played by violinist Todd Reynolds. So you have these two things working on our brains all the time, right? We have the structure within, and then we have this ephemeral thinking process that goes on. So it was important to me to imagine that, what that might be like. And in a time where we think about our brains being taken over, when we think about our brains being manipulated or hacked, particularly with the sophistication of technology, I just wanted to get everyone to focus in on this intimate portrait of ourselves that's happening within each one of us.
Let me pose a question to both of you, which is one thing that links scientific research and artistic development is imagining the unknown and developing processes to develop that. Can you, both of you, talk a little bit about how the process of imagining and then dealing with the unknown plays into your own work?
So I might start with this, and I think very much of the intimacy of a visit that I would have if I visited you in your lab, and you came to my studio. I think very much about the process. What incites our curiosity, and curiosity is from the Latin word cura, which means to care, which has this beautiful notion, particularly in at times like this, when we hope that people would have more curiosity to care about the complexities of, say, this pandemic. And it starts with the question. It's all about the questions, right? And I'm very good at questions and much less good at answers. But the inquiry of why things are, how they come about. For me, I have come to trust my questions and to take notice of the things that interest me. And that's a big process, right? That is something that oftentimes we're told, oh, don't do that. Don't draw in class. Don't move around. I've come to really believe that we uniquely occupy a place and have unique talents in this world that can be manifested in various ways. Following those authentic ideas and that pure curiosity leads to nourishing investigation. Leon, tell me about your process of investigating and imagining things.
I think, like you, curiosity is the key point. I mean, you have to be curious, I think, to be an artist and to be a scientist. And in many respects, science and art are very similar. I mean, although by appearances they're very different, but if you actually look at the process, talking to you and talking to other friend artists, I realized that the process is to a great extent very similar, and it always starts with a curiosity and with a question. So my students know that I always ask them, when they come to me with some idea, I ask them, okay, that's great, but what is the question that you're asking? Which is something that I have to say that I've learned from my mentor, the late Professor Shlomo Bentin. He would always tell me, what is the question that you're asking? And you're right to the point. The question is what's important. But how do you form the questions? How do you form the right questions? So I think that's the challenge And the answer is that I don't really know how to form the right questions. And the nice thing about being a scientist is that you're allowed to try and error, right? That's, trial and error. That's the slogan. And so you're being like, some people say that it's the art of failure. So we fail more than we succeed, but we develop this method of actually bootstrapping by from the failures, from making the failures the main thing. I mean, the thing that you learn from. So do you feel the same? Do you do the same? I think you probably do this experimentation and fail and fail and fail until you get it, right?
Yeah, so how's the saying go? That to have a lot of successes, you have to have a lot of failure. And you need to take action. Another favorite word is courage. And courage is from, I'm on this whole etymology rant. It is from the French meaning heart, right? It's the heart, that instinct you have to move towards something. And I think often about how we might recontextualize failure, because failure really is data, and it's clear data. So much of the world we live in is the gray area, and it's judgment and probabilities. And in many ways that's the best we can do. But if I'm working, with some encaustic message, encaustic material, and it starts smoking, I pretty much know not to do that anymore, right? So in some ways, it is in the spirit of the scientific method, but of course, the costs are so much more consequential in many aspects of science. Do you consider yourself a basic researcher versus a clinical researcher?
Yeah, I'm mostly a basic researcher. So some of my work tries to move towards what we call translation. So translation from bench to bed. So we try to move towards that, but most of the work is basic science. Yeah.
And does that ever does that pressure to translate? Particularly, but now with the development of the vaccines, does that affect your work? Does that affect your questions?
To me personally, I'm too far away from immunology and vaccines and stuff like that, so it doesn't really affect my questions that much. The pressure for translation is always there. I mean, you always have to think, what actually are we doing? How will it ever affect society? The truth is that, if you look at the history of basic science, eventually, in mysterious ways, develops into ways to actually make some good. But we have to remind ourselves of that sometimes, because sometimes you do ask yourself, when is it going to be ripe for actually doing any change to anybody? But I'm a true believer in basic science. I think that looking at basic science eventually puts the foundations for the things which become practical and implementable. The achievements that you see now with 6 months, after the beginning of the pandemic, you already have tens of.
Leon, you got muted.
It was something done from somewhere else. Okay, so I'm not sure, but what I'm saying is that the fact that we moved so rapidly into developing a vaccine, it's just a testament for how much basic science has been done in the background for decades. Allowed us suddenly, when we need it, to have it in hand. It's a little bit like evolution. You gather these occult traits that you don't really need so much, but then something happens, a change in the environment, and you realize that you have what it needs to survive. Yeah, so basic science, I think, is important, but we have to sometimes go towards translation.
So there are two things you talk about. What one is the idea or the question you have, and that's the starting point. Mm-hmm. In my practice, the idea and the work comes out of the process. Can you tell us a little bit about how you come to the questions that are of course so interesting or compelling to you, and how do you process that, knowing that maybe there won't be an ultimate translation, but still there is a cache of information developed that is of great value.
So when you said that it comes out of the process, what do you mean by come out?
So the testing process, right? Try this, it fails, try this, this works, and all the research and the testing that you do. And maybe you need to help me understand a bit about how you pursue those ideas when you're dealing with people, living beings, as opposed to me working with materials.
Yeah. So it's a good question of how questions come about. It's like asking how thoughts come about, which is probably the thing that we know least. How thoughts actually pop into our heads. So you know how it is. Sometimes the questions just one begets the other. And this is probably what you mean by through the process. So you're busy asking one question, and then suddenly you bump into a new question that might be as interesting or even more interesting than the previous one, and you have to choose which one you're going to follow at any given moment. And so that's one way. The other way, which is more top down, is that sometimes you start with a big question, then you say, okay, I have this big question, but how am I going to go about actually investigating it? I mean, I have to break it into something which I can bring into the lab. I have to plan an experiment that will give an answer to this question. And at least in my practice, eventually, sometimes you ask yourself, how did I get to this point? I mean, how did I get to do this experiment? Start thinking that what I'm interested in is consciousness. I mean, but I'm doing this experiment. How is it linked? And I have to sort of track back to the big question, which I find really interesting to find the path that we actually went towards this discovery, which is interesting in and of itself. But how does it actually shed light on the bigger question that we are investigating?
So how did you know that this was something that you had to do with your life? What were the indicators? Oftentimes I'd like to look back, ask people what they did when they were little before they knew anyone was looking. What were those things that may have been the seeds of what became your leading professorship?
Well, I'll answer, if you promise to answer two. I mean, the same question.
Be happy to.
Because I'm curious. But for me, it wasn't like I always knew that I'm going to be a scientist or a professor or definitely not a neuroscientist in particular. But I studied medicine. And when as a medical student, as part of the curriculum, I went into the rehabilitation department, and was simply amazed by the types of phenomena that you could observe when you were looking at the behavior of people who had brain damage. I mean, this was kind of a revelation about the way the brain works and about the way the brain can break down in very particular ways. Something that actually fascinated many before me, of course, but for me as a young student, it was really a striking thing. I mean, the complexity and the sometimes strange ways in which people, the famous title from Oliver Sacks, the man who mistook his wife for a hat. So these kinds of behaviors, which might look odd when you look at them, but when you understand the mechanism and the process underlying them, make much more sense. And on the other hand, by looking at these behaviors, you can start making sense of the way even healthy people behave, and that really amazed me. And I realized that this is what is actually making me excited. This is what excites me. And so slowly I moved from actually doing medicine to doing more basic research in this field, and so that's how it evolved for me. But it wasn't like a very early childhood dream to do these things. I was always curious, but
So for me, when I look back, I was always making, building, and getting into mischief. And what I mean by that, I was wondering what was behind the wallpaper. So I would tear that off, or I would connect the dots in the ceiling of my dad's car just because they needed to be connected. I was always building things, and my tools were this set of Encyclopedia Britannica books, which is a quaint notion. And when I took my dad's classical records and I put it on a turntable, well, this is like memory lane here, and I took the needle and I actually made gestures in the record with the needle. I was just so excited that I had expressed these marks in a new way. The feedback was not positive, and at age 7, my parents said, "We have to save our belongings," and off to art school, an adult art studio I went. But I continue to think about not only the making and what things are made of, but the concentration of my hand, sight, and brain connection. And that's why drawing for me has always been a starting tool of revelation. And, the tactile, the index is something that opens a thread for me. And then after, a multi-hyphenate career, as so many of us experience, of Wall Street finance, family business, I knew I had to come back to this, and went to graduate school in 2010 and launched my practice after graduating. But there was something there, when so often people talk about they played with cars, or they were interested in logs or Legos. So I wonder how much of that is within us before we even realize it.
Paula, can you comment a little more about the interplay between technology and your art? And for example, two-dimensional versus three-dimensional imaging, and how that impacts your work?
I'd be happy to. And I think about you think about the way you are in the world, and we all have particular gifts. There'll never be anyone else like you on this planet, Dan, and there never was anyone like you. You have these particular gifts and talents by this random chaotic process, organization of molecules, and what we call the life force. For me, I realized later in life that I saw spatially differently than other people. And so when I started working with the drawings, I was thinking about how much pressure affected the ink into the drawings, almost depth maps, if you will. And I wanted to know the translation of the pressure into actually a three-dimensional form. I was always curious to see what would happen if I made a 3D drawing and I turned it in space or I inverted it. And using computer graphics and so many new tools, new arrows in our quiver, I was able to more readily present those ideas and then translate them to actual sculptures or 3D images in various ways and alter scale and material to see how they would live in the world.
It's fascinating. I think we could stay on this topic for a long time, but let's turn to another topic because we have limited time. We want to talk a little bit about perception versus reality, which is something that impacts both of your work significantly. And maybe to start this off, Leon, could you tell us a little bit more about how the brain works in terms of absorbing information and distinguishing between reality and imagination?
It's a great question, and also a very timely question. It's now highly debated in neuroscience and psychology. I would say that a traditional way of thinking about perception, I would say in the last 40 or 50 years, was that the brain absorbs information from the outside. The light first hits our retina and the eyes, and then the signals travel to our brains, and then they're little by little analyzed. First the lines, then the contours, then the shapes, then the surfaces, then we create representations of actual objects. Then we actually ask ourselves, quote unquote, what is this object? Do I have any knowledge about this? And I recognize this as my phone or my cup or my pencil and so on. And then I can realize what I can do with it, how to hold it and so on. So it's like a hierarchical process, building from the elements, building the object of perception. And the same would be true for audition as well. So you start from simple acoustics, the height of tones, then you put them together into more elaborate structures, maybe phonemes or musical structures, and then you build them into syllables and words and so on. So that is, indeed, you can see, if you look in the brain, look at neurons in the brain, you could see that indeed there are neurons, which are the building blocks of the brain, which represent in their actions either simpler forms or more elaborate forms or complete objects. So in some sense, this model was validated by the data. But on the other hand, there were old ideas which now resurface about the fact that that the way we actually perceive the world, especially consciously, is by applying to these bottom-up percepts, we apply to them top-down beliefs, expectations, prior knowledge, and that actually shapes the way we interpret or we make inference about what our senses are absorbing from the outside. So it's more and more realized that what we actually perceive is kind of a interaction between our prior beliefs and expectations and the actual information that comes from the environment, which makes you think that what we perceive, what I perceive and what Paula perceives or Dan perceives is not necessarily exactly the same thing, even though we're actually looking at the same object in space. So we get the same information, but we come to it with different expectations, different experiences, different contexts. And so what we perceive is different, which I have to say that to me seems important not only from the point of view of science. We say in science, what we are trying to figure out is exactly what are these connections, where do they come from, how are they implemented in the brain mechanistically. But if you think about it, if you think of the times we live in, where you have people live in different realities, what is fake news for one is the real news for the other. I think simply realizing that we may be seeing different things or perceiving different things than others can be helpful in resolving some of the tensions. I mean, accepting the fact that not what you see and what somebody else is seeing is not necessarily exactly the same thing. Not to say that there are different realities, but that the way we perceive them may be inherently at least a little bit different from one another. And it's not easy to answer your question. How do I know what part is my prior beliefs and expectation, and what part is like valid reality? Is something that perhaps philosophers can answer better than neuroscientists.
So in some ways, it just sounds like our brain is a big story generator, right? With sensory input from all directions. When you think about our perceptions that are affected by heuristics or emotions, or whoever knows how they have been implanted in our neurology. Has any of your research, or is it your observation that maybe we can suspend or affect that process? In other words, trying to shear away all of the noise. I always try to think, is that true? And what am I really responding to? Have you done any work or observed any opportunity to do that so we can get to a shared reality?
I think the Buddhists had it better than the neuroscientists. The answer to this question. I can't say anything from the point of view of neuroscience about what you need to do to sort of reduce the effect of prior conceptions, prejudices, and so on, except for what psychologists keep telling us, that cognitive psychologists, social psychologists, that simply by acknowledging the fact that we are affected by these prior beliefs and expectations can help in reducing their effect. I mean, maybe more than anything else. And I put aside meditation and all these practices that do, I think, have a lot in them in trying to practice reducing the noise and the inner voices and so on. But that I say as a meditator, not as a...
Paula, can you comment a little bit about sensory perception, the role of sight? You talked a little bit before about music in your work, about the tactile sense of holding a pencil or a crayon. And there's another sense that comes in the context of your own work, which is pain. We think of artists as having to suffer in order to create the beauty of their work. And that's a real definite factor in this subject that we're talking about of your own art. How do you perceive the senses, and how does that translate into your creations?
Oh yes, the old suffering is the pathway to salvation idea, and that's why I meditate, so so I can reduce and challenge that idea. Dan, if I could just put a circle around this, because I want to follow up on one thing that
Please.
Leon said. Thank you. Is I know as an artist how varied perceptions are. And I never knew that the most nourishing part of my practice would be seeing how people interact with the art and add to the story. And that to me is the superpower of art, is its possibility to get us to pause, maybe get outside of ourselves, imagine other possibilities. And to have more fruitful conversations. but the way people have completed the story of this red Solo cup, which started about an examination of how we each leave marks in the world, and how we need to think about that, how that affects all of us collectively. We think about it so much, you know, in dealing with the pandemic, how our behavior affects others. I heard someone in front of one of my works just say, yes, and she's very interested in the environment, and this is really about not using single-use plastics. And I stood there and I just said, that's so beautiful, right? It's not my story, but it's a story that is additive to the whole experience. So I am open to perceptions, which is sometimes are, you know, you have to stand in the storm, and you have to figure out what's relevant to you if there's a negative reaction to an artwork. But I just wanted to follow up on that acknowledgement of perceptions that are different, but also can augment. So back to your question. And this speaks to distractions and attention, right? And this is something that I'm going to continue to bother Leon over these thousands of miles virtually with how we come to know our own brains, how we can choose to focus on things versus others. And for me, in a very basic way, again, the thing that was, you know, taken out of my hand when I was a child, the way I know the world the best is through the gesture, through that mark making. There's something happening in that indexical process, and I don't know what it is, but it is the sensory. It's the visual acuity. It is the translation to the physical that helps bring everything into a tighter lens. And Liana, maybe you could comment on what you've seen about how the physical senses can tie into attention or behavior.
So attention, I mean, attention is one of the biggest things in the way the brain works. And if you think of attention as the mechanism that allows you to resolve competition, okay? The senses, you know, bring in a lot of competition from different stimuli coming in. They can be different visual stimuli. They can be auditory. You know, people speaking in the street right now while we are trying to make this conversation, and we have to. So there's a bombardment of these different things that I could be dealing with at this moment, and the attention is the mechanism which allows us to increase the gain, so to speak, on some and reduce the gain on the others. We call it selective attention. This is a huge thing. I think everybody can sympathize with this notion that we need to somehow filter out, screen, you know, some of this stuff in order to be able to focus, as you say, Paula, on the things that we are interested in. Some of us are better at this, and some of us are worse at this. You know, filtering distractions. And there's a lot of work having been done on some in my lab and in many other labs about what are the brain mechanisms that allow us to do this process of selective attention. One of the dominant models at the moment is that we have at least two major parts to this process of selective attention. One is the part which allows us to actually focus on something, and the other, which is necessary, is the one that will allow us to shift our attention if something more interesting, more important actually happens. And I think it's important for everybody to understand that you wouldn't survive if you had only the first one and not the latter. Okay, because if you focus your attention on something and you don't have a mechanism that in the background automatically monitors the environment and watches for things that could be of importance to you. I mean, if you're living in the jungle, is there a leopard coming in to eat you, or is there a rabbit that you can now devour? Those are very important information. You can't be just be mesmerized by the sunset this moment, right? So we need these two mechanisms which are kind of balancing each other. One which is focusing, and the other one which is breaking in and saying we need to shift our attention. This is what actually started my work on the field, this understanding this mechanism of background monitoring. And we have this especially prominent in audition, because audition, you don't have to actually turn your ears into something. You hear all the time from all directions. And so there's this mechanism that constantly monitors for odd things, unexpected things that happen in the environment and allow you to switch your attention if needed to these events. It's still to this day, thing that we're investigating, trying to figure out how does the brain really know what is odd, what is worth alerting us about in this subconscious, pre-attentive part of the processing. So it's this. Yeah.
So let's talk about the gut for a moment. I have a friend who's a neuroscientist, and I was like, I don't know. I just feel this in my gut. It's not a rational process. And she said, of course it is. Your gut is your brain. Can you comment on that? Sixth sense, or is it just another story that we tell ourselves, or we just by luck we imagine an outcome that comes about, and I knew that. I felt that in my gut.
So there's a lot to say about that, and starting from the fact, which is just in parentheses, that the gut actually has a humongous nervous system. I mean, some people say that it's as big as the brain, but that's just a curiosity. The gut is not doing the thinking. It's the brain. But gut feeling is, when you say gut feeling, what you mean is that you have some bodily sensation that is indicating something. Okay, now of course the body and the brain are one. I mean, we call it the embodied brain. I mean, we sometimes talk about the brain and forget about the body, but it's merely more for convenience than something real. In fact, the brain's goal is to to help us survive. Our bodies survive, and so the brain and the body are connected within the nervous system, and so everything that happens in the brain could affect your bodily sensations, and every bodily sensation will affect what you feel, think, and so on, because you have exteroception, which is the world outside, the eyes, the ears, and you have interoception, which is how you feel what's happening in your body. Okay, now in some cases the feeling in your body will be, I would say, a manifestation of things that happen primarily in your brain first. So you think of somebody you love, and you have we say butterflies in your stomach, right? Or you have some kind of reason to be stressed, and you feel tension in your muscles, and this is definitely the result of something happening in your brain. And some people may be able, to actually use this information, the sensation in their body, and have this what they call gut feeling, which is actually a response in the body of something that is some thought process, some information processing that is going on in their head. But of course, it could be just the other way up too. I mean, there could be sensations that initiate in your gut. I mean, for something that you ate, okay? So it's really something that happens in your gut, and then your interpretation of it in your head, because the brain is going to sense this, it might be interpreted as stress or as something more mental, whereas in fact it is something that is more primarily bodily. I don't know if you've heard about this old-time theory of William James, was a famous philosopher and psychologist at the end of the 19th century, and he and others developed this idea that our emotions are actually our interpretation of the way our body is. So if I happen to move my lips up,
right.
this is sensed as being happy, and I'm happy. Okay, not the other way up. I'm not smiling because I'm happy because I'm smiling. And there's been a lot of controversy in recent years about some empirical results about that, but to a great extent, there is something, I think there is something to it. Come back to your question, our bodies react to what happens in our brain, or our brain affects what's happening in our body, and vice versa. The brain interprets things that happen in our body and can sometimes give them erroneous interpretations based on the same expectations, beliefs, and so on.
Exactly. Yeah. No, it's a slippery slope. So I think about over the last 8-9 months, and when I haven't wanted to move, when I wanted to be in a this place of anxiety and uncertainty, I've tried to make myself always move. And I actually do this thing called smile yoga. And, it is the cues the body can give that can send signals. You're the one to help me understand this, that say that this is a good thing, right? Or this is something nourishing. So that interplay is really so important. Keep smiling. That's for sure. Stay positive, test negative. That's my daily phrase. If we can get back to attention, in these days where we're not in a jungle, where we don't have to be so, our sense is so attenuated, the fight and flight in our reptilian brain, how do we close down this unnecessary stimuli? And I think about this in the way I approach my practice. I try to reduce all the stimuli early in the morning, which is sort of my sweet spot in terms of energy. And it's a discipline. We have these dopamine hits, these distractions. What's the latest news feed? What's the latest sports score? What's the latest podcast drop? Do you have any sense for how that is affecting our brains, how that's affecting particularly those of the younger generation?
So this would not be from my own research, because this is not the thing that I'm actually investigating directly, but the current, let's say, zeitgeist in neuroscience and psychology is that we are not good multi-threaders. We don't really do well with multiple tasks at the same time. And the feeling of some people that they can actually multitask really well is to a great degree an illusion. And there's a price people pay when they actually do multitask too much. And I mean, you don't have to be a scientist to realize that with this, the phone in my hand and then the iPad here and the computer over here, I'm serious. This is what's in front of me right now. It's really easy to try to do this multitasking and move from writing your paper to answering your email to answering WhatsApp to reading the news. And I think, Paula, I think your remedy for this is the right one. I guess it's discipline. I mean, some of us are better at this and some of us are worse, but it's mainly practice and discipline of what we do to remove these distractions. Some of it is probably, the best way is probably the most mundane thing, shut it down. Go into a quiet room and go to climb a mountain. That's the thing. Yeah.
What do you think nature does to our attention and focus? Why is that so important, especially at times like this when we feel so isolated?
So what do you mean? But what nature does?
Being in nature. So there have been some studies. I believe it's Mark Bourbon at University of Chicago who talked about being in nature can improve attention and focus. And the whole idea there was not only the colors are soothing, particularly green, and the idea of looking at organic forms versus geometric forms of, say, an urban existence is something that is, that feeds our brain, that maybe helps dilate our point of view, and gives us some respite.
So it sounds very reasonable. I think it's a really interesting perspective. I think what I can add to that is that when you go into nature, you usually also do physical exercise, and so you actually walk into nature rather than just be sitting in a chair. And more studies in neuroscience suggest that the best thing you can do for your brain is exercise. It's sometimes sad. I mean, we don't all like to exercise, but time after time, when they try to figure out what are the things that can improve your cognition when you get older, what are the things that can make more cells form in your brain every day, and that we do form cells in our brain, and they're very important, for instance, for memory. So when you ask what can you do? Should you do Sudoku? Should you eat vitamins? The only thing that comes again and again is physical exercise. So I guess part of going into nature is indeed the fact that you can look far, it's very different from what you do every day. It might be organic forms and the soothing colors for sure, but it's also the fact that you have to climb the hill.
Forgive me for jumping in, because you guys could go on for a long time, fascinating all of us.
Sorry about that.
We are sadly drawing to the end of our hour. Before we turn to some questions from participants, if each of you would like to take just a brief minute to sum up your reflections on the topic, I think we'd be interested in hearing that. And then Naomi will lead us through some of the questions from the participants. Paula, final thoughts?
I did just so appreciative, of having conversations that expand understanding, that help me ask better questions, how both the art that I'm making that's generated from my own imagination, how it can affect others for good, and the importance of being vigilant about the distractions in our life, and going back and really focusing on getting to know one's own brain, as opposed to it being hijacked by outside forces. And so, Leon, this has been so extraordinary. And Dan and the team at Hebrew University, I just want to thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Leon, a final comment, and then we'll turn to some questions.
I want to say that first, that I'm grateful for the fact that I have the opportunity to do what I do. I think it's the place I am, the ILSEC, and the Hebrew University, and simply being a scientist, I think is a big privilege that society gives us. So that's amazing. And talking to Paula, I think I have to say that the connections between the way the artists think and the scientists think always surprise me. And I would also have to say that I'm a little bit envious of the fact that while we both, we say we ask questions, we make hypotheses, we do research, but the artists have the freedom to do it in so many more ways than scientists can. So scientists live under very, very strict rules of how things must be done in order to be credible, reliable, replicable, and so on. And artists have this freedom to explore much further, and therefore sometimes they are actually ahead of scientists. And it's simply fascinating. So thank you all for this opportunity.
Great. Okay, Naomi, I see you have a bunch of questions assembled both in the chat and the Q&A.
Questions, yeah. I have a lot. I already apologize. I don't think we'll get to all of them, but we'll try to have a sampling at least, and hope that we answer everybody with something. From Ellen Weiss, she said, "How important is the music to absorbing the brain journey for you and for others?"
That's a question for Paula, I guess.
Either of you, yeah. Either of you can. I think she was referring to the video also with the music that was on it.
It was an additive experience, and it is not my realm. I'm not a musician, but working with musicians, also working with the computer technologist, understanding how it could paint a fuller picture. So I would say it was very important, and it's part of a process of having an ecosystem of people who can come together and expand on ideas.
Okay, here's one from Franz. He says, "Is the perception of beauty a subjective matter, or can aesthetics be objective? Can we understand the author's intended meaning in a work of art, or our brain will always read in it according to our experiences?"
Okay, I'll take that.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll start, at least start, and then Paula can jump in.
Okay.
So to the last part of the question, I would say definitely we see art through our brains, through our eyes. I mean, we're coming with our prior knowledge. I know for myself that it's very different for me to watch art that I know something about the history of the specific period, or about the artist, or seeing the same art piece the second time. I see it in a different way. So it's definitely not just the pixels of light, hitting our retina. There's much more into the perception. About beauty and whether it's going to be objectified or not. I mean, millennial philosophers have discussed this question. There's now a group of scientists who are trying to look at the brain, what parts of the brain or the mechanism in the brain which are responsible for perception of aesthetics. Whether this will be fruitful or whether or not, I'm not sure. It remains to be seen whether we will get any insight about beauty by looking at the way the brain processes beauty. I think people would doubt that, but we'll see. Paula?
So interesting. So my question is, how is beauty additive to our survival, or how did that evolve? So we know that there's a lot of alignment over, say, the golden proportions in a face. We know that people feel by and large calmer in symmetrical spaces. And so there's some underlying structure that has been reinforced over time, whether or not that's beauty or something that provides some space or calm. And I've been doing some work on these cave signs that have been found across Europe, that some of which go back 40,000 years, pre-language. And they're remarkable in that they could have been done today. You have something that looks like a hashtag, you have an arrow, you have a circle, you have the handprint. And so what are those elements that still we carry forward deeply in our brain? Maybe they were identifying danger, they were identifying other tribes, or who knows what. So there is a thread, but as we know, it's really hard to identify. And looking at art, I think people put way too much burden on themselves, right? Trust what you feel, and ask the questions. And before we immediately go to good, bad, ugly, great, just think about how it makes you feel and see if it keeps giving, if it continues to have elements that expand your world.
Thank you. Okay, now we have one from Joyce, who lived until her 50s as a clinical psychologist. Then she developed functional neurological disorder, which had a strong effect on her. And then she discovered art, and she became a full-time artist. And she was wondering if her advent as an artist why it was not there before, and why it only came out when she had this disorder. So any insights from either of you are welcome.
I'm going to hand that to Leon first, and then I'll give the theory, my theory.
So of course it's hard to tell, of an individual experience what exactly it was, but I can just comment that in many cases we have these traits and skills which just don't get the opportunity to develop, and then we suddenly have the opportunity. Sometimes you think you have a disadvantage, but then this becomes really an advantage, because it allows you to put on those skills and traits and wishes and likings that you had even before. So I would say this is at least one of the reasons that these things can develop. Of course, there might be something in the hardship that you have to go through that boldens these traits. But perhaps Paula can comment more on the artistic feeling and artistic form.
The question I would ask is, what did you do when you were younger? What were the things that you were attracted to? Maybe the secret was there and that got pushed aside, or maybe just as Leon said, there are other areas that became more prominent of your sensory system. And that was something that interested you, and you continued to follow that. I can't comment, at all from a neuroscientific point of view, but I'm really glad we need more creatives and innovative thinkers in the world.
Okay, this next one was actually sent to Leon. How much do you think quantum physics can solve the problem of consciousness? Now, I'm not sure if that is a question. I didn't understand it at all, but maybe
there are people, serious physicists, who do think that quantum physics is the answer to the question of consciousness. I do not understand quantum physics well enough to even comment on this aspiration. I would say that most of consciousness scientists try to explain consciousness in more in non-quantum ways. So through psychology and neuroscience and philosophy and traditional philosophy, but there are definitely because there is something which seems mysterious about consciousness. But how is it that molecules and electrical currents and voltages and blood and tissue, and how does it come about that this brings together a thought, or a mental act? It looks like there is this unbridgeable gap between the biology and the mental life, and people try to bring in sometimes magical solutions to that. Sometimes they resort to things which are, to me, like magic, but I realize that for physicists, they're really something which they can actually write in mathematical formulas like quantum physics. But others feel that they can actually speak about it in more everyday biology, psychology terminology. I'm one of those.
So I think on a computational side, the engineering and the analysis that can happen will be profound. I don't know if it's going to solve our understanding of where thoughts come from or how we think, but we may get closer. Just understanding topically, just the idea of quantum physics, there are two things that I continue to think about. This idea that our brains and minds can be in multi-positional states. And the idea of networks and entanglement provides to me maybe some idea of how these networks all interrelate on an incredibly complex level. That's very, it's very topical. But I'm fascinated with the whole field.
Well, we have something now in the field of migraines. One of the people wrote in the chats, Yoli, as an artist since he was a child, or she, I'm actually not sure, they suffered from migraines all their adult life and had trouble sleeping because the creative mind was always on. So they're asking, how can I mentally organize my thoughts and ideas so that it doesn't affect my brain? I too am very curious as well, and have to just deconstruct my materials before working with them. Is this normal? Should I just allow my mind to run 24 hours? So this is a real, this probably needs about an hour.
So my experience in understanding migraineurs, and I am sorry that this is something that we suffer from, is also, it's the way you explained it is the way I think about it. This incredible, it's sometimes overly stimulated sensory mode. That the light is a certain way, and I have to close the shades or put on glasses, or sound affects me in a hyper-aware state. I would say the thing that has helped me the most is probably meditation practices and walking and being outside. But the idea of trying to remove myself, my brain, asking myself what's true, and trying to get some distance by getting back into to my body, to my breathing. And I guess for me, getting into the mark making.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and a very specific question about the brain scans in the video. Andrea asked, are the peaks and valleys that appear and disappear actual measurements of something, or are they artistic manipulations of the data?
They are manipulations of the data. It's totally imagined, and that is my hope in doing a functional MRI. Don't know if I can do that distantly, Leon, but I love that idea. So what we did is we just have a sequence of pictures that we put together. The undulating marks, that is computer graphic imagination of what it might be like.
Okay, Dan, did you want to wrap up, or did you have some question that you wanted to ask?
I think we should probably wrap up. I want to thank again our speakers, Paula and Leon. You're terrific, and maybe we can find a way to do this again, because there's so much more to explore with you both.
Hopefully in Jerusalem.
Yes, absolutely. We want to get there when we can.
That.
And thanks to all our participants for tuning in. We had tremendous participation. Naomi and your team, Francine, thanks for all your work, and to the Hebrew University for providing the platform. And stay healthy, everyone. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks.